Hey guys, Jake here. So one of the reasons that I started this channel was to help people grow financially. And in this video, we're going to go over 8 places you should consider putting your money after you've been paid. Now, this may seem like a simple topic, but plenty of people who make $50,000 a year or more are actually poor because of the way that they handle their money. Like, say you make $100,000 a year, but you end up spending $90,000 a year on, rent, food, and a bunch of other things, but just things you don't really need. You're only really saving $10,000 a year. So you could be saving the same amount of money as somebody who's only making $50,000 a year in comparison. 41% of Americans can't pay a $1,000 emergency debt. And likewise, 35% of Canadians couldn't handle an extra $2,000 expense within the next month. So the main issue here is that people don't know how to manage their money, and they're not treating themselves like a business. This information isn't taught in schools or anything, unless you take some kind of course specific to it. And if you don't have some family member or friend who's going to teach this stuff to you, you'll never really be subjected to it. This can lead to generations who encounter similar money problems. So, again, we're going to go over 8 different ways that you can manage your money more effectively once you've been paid. Let's get into it. So the first thing here is actually a retirement fund, which is kind of cheating because it actually happens before you get paid. But in the United States, this is a 401k generally, and in Canada, it's usually an RRSP. Usually the recommended contribution for something like this is between 15 and 20% of your paycheck. However, if you can do as little as 5% or even less if need be, it's still something. So these are pre-tax contributions, meaning that the money is added to your retirement account before you even pay income tax on it. Doing this as soon as possible is great, especially if you have an employer who's actually willing to match your contributions. Because if that's the case, it's essentially free money. So number 2, your paycheck goes into your checking account. This is usually the step that most people will get to because most people have a checking account. So whether you get paid electronically and it just automatically goes into your account, or you get cash or a check and you deposit it yourself, this is usually where the money ends up. Now, this is a great step because it's the perfect place to have your money as kind of like the base camp. Now, the reason this is so good is because it can hold the majority of it initially, and then you can start piping it out to various places, which are the following steps. Number 3, this is essentially the things you need to live, which is obviously pretty important. Now, the important distinction here is the needs versus the wants. So these are your needs, again, in order to live. So this includes housing, food, hydro, water, medical insurance if you live in the US. One thing that's important here, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, is that people often spend way too much money on food and housing. So for food, the simple one is just if you go out and eat or do takeout very often, you're going to end up spending way more money in the long run than if you just purchased groceries and made the food yourself. Sure, it takes a little bit of time, but it also can be fun, and it's also a good skill to just have. The second thing is for housing. For me, I try and ensure that my housing costs per month are at most 50% of my monthly income. I know that sounds like a lot, but say I'm making $2,000 a month. If I'm spending $1,000 or more, generally that's going to be too much money. Essentially, that just means that you're not going to have enough money left over in order to be doing the rest of the things that we're going to be talking about in this video. So if you are spending too much money on housing, it may mean you need to find a new place, whether that's a new house, a new apartment, or maybe even a new city or town that's close by where things are much cheaper. All right, so we have our essentials handled. The next step, number 4, is an emergency fund. So like I talked about at the start of this video, 41% of Americans couldn't handle a $1,000 emergency debt, and 35% of Canadians couldn't handle a $2,000 unknown expense that happened within the next month. So this is kind of where this comes in. So an emergency fund should just be money that is used for an emergency.
I think it knows where it is going. The machine knows! Stop yelling at me! No, it's up yelling! There's no road here!
So the basic thing here is just that, say you need your car to go and get groceries, to go to work, and your car breaks down. You should have some form of emergency fund in order to be able to fix your car. Or you have a medical expense that comes up. You should then be able to pay for your medical expense with your emergency fund. This is an emergency fund, so it is not for things like the new PlayStation. It is not an emergency that you don't own the new PlayStation, or the new video game, or Netflix. Not emergencies. You should not be paying for any of those types of things with an emergency fund. So start by taking $10 or $20 from every paycheck and just putting it into your emergency fund. This may not seem like a lot of money that you're contributing, but if it's every paycheck, it can start to add up. It's worth mentioning that even if you're in debt, this is something that's really important to have. Because sure, maybe you're in debt and you still owe a lot of money, but if another emergency comes up and you still can't pay that emergency, then you could go further into debt. Now I'm going to talk about 4B, which is smashing that like button for the YouTube algorithm. It really helps out, and yeah, I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. Yeah, good. Thank you. Cool. So, number 5, debts. Everyone's favorite thing. So, one of the issues with being in debt is that it can become this thing that's just always in the back of your mind that you kind of just want to procrastinate and not pay attention to. That's kind of the worst thing that you can do with a debt, because if you try to ignore it, it can have some pretty catastrophic consequences. So there's a bunch of ways you could handle debt, but I'm going to talk about 2 different ways called the avalanche and the snowball method. So with the snowball method, say you have 2 forms of debt. You have student loan debt, where you owe $20,000, and you have credit card debt, where you owe $2,000. Now, using the snowball method, you would then target the credit card debt. The reason for that is because it's the least amount of debt. So essentially you're going to be putting as much money as you can comfortably and start paying down that debt. Now, that debt will then eventually be gone, and once you've paid it off, you will have fewer debts. The idea is that if you can just continue to pay off the smallest form of debt, then your overall number of debts that you owe will start to go down. One of the great things about this is that if it continues to go down, then you start to feel really good about it. Honestly, the positivity that you feel from paying off some form of debt can be pretty powerful. Even though it seems like that may be a bit of a joke, it's one thing that can kind of encourage you to continue. So let's go over the avalanche method, which is one of the other methods to paying off debt. In this case, we're going to actually target our debts based off of the one with the highest interest rate. So say we have 3 debts. We have a car loan debt, which has a 5% interest rate, a student loan debt, which has no interest rate right now because we are still a student, and we have a credit card debt, which has a potentially 20% interest rate. Now, the most important thing we should try and pay off here is the credit card debt. The reason for this is because if we don't pay it off, it's going to start snowballing and growing exponentially because of its high interest rate. Now, once we've paid that off, we can then start targeting the next highest interest rate, which, assuming we're still a student, is likely going to be the car debt. So then we would then pay off the car debt, and finally we would have just the student loan debt. It may be worth mentioning that, of course, you can target multiple debts at once. However, it can be discouraging sometimes if you're just constantly throwing money at a number of debts and none of them are really going away. So with these other methods, you can at least target them and just obliterate them, get them out of there, because it'll end up feeling a lot better. So number 6 is 4 to 8 months of payroll. Ideally, you could do a year, but that's pretty unrealistic for most people. So the great thing about this is that it gives you an incredible peace of mind knowing that if something happened where you lost your job or for some reason you couldn't work, you would still have money that you could then rely on. So the best place to store this 4 to 8 months of payroll is in some form of online savings account. The reason for this is that you can generally get a fairly good interest rate on that savings account. It's still relatively accessible and you're actually holding up with inflation. If you think it's unrealistic to hold 4 months of payroll, then just try and aim for 1. And then once you have 1, see if you can get to 2. Try and grow it over time. This is something that in the past year, given the pandemic and so many people losing their jobs, it probably would have been an incredible thing to have if you weren't fortunate enough to have it. So number 7 is short-term savings. So this is a savings fund or account that we would have where we want to save up for something in the short term, which again, pretty simple, kind of self-explanatory there. But the goal for this is, say we want to save up to buy a house or to buy a car or some kind of larger expense. What we'd like to do is be able to save some money and just put it in a savings account where it's going to gradually, grow with basic interest rates. So not grow that much, but grow a little bit and just not touch that. Now, we only want to do this. I'm going to say it again because it's important. If we are saving up for something big in the future. And again, in the not so distant future. If you already own a house and you aren't interested in investing in real estate, you have a car, you aren't going to be buying a new car anytime soon, you probably don't need to do this. You can probably skip this number. This is purely for cases where you would like to purchase something large in the not so distant future. Great, so number 8, you've made it. So number 8 is long-term investing. So this is investing in the stock market, bonds, real estate, crypto, if you believe in the power of crypto, which if you've seen it recently, you probably should. Yeah, that's the whole idea for this one. So of course, you can start investing in the stock market or in any of these really, while you're doing any of the other things. However, if it's a toss-up between investing in the stock market and having an emergency fund, personally, I think anything prior to this is something that you should maybe think about prioritizing over this step. Of course, having long-term investments is really the way that you can actually not only maintain your wealth, but grow it, potentially exponentially, because you can quite literally become rich through this step. So just because you can become rich from this step does not mean that you should just say, well, sure, I have my credit card debt, I might lose my job, I don't have an emergency fund, but I'm just going to invest in the stock market. It's probably not the best call. The reason for that is that if the stock market goes, generally the stock market goes up, about 8 to 10% throughout the year. However, if you make a bad call, you could lose a lot of money. Not to mention, if you have credit card debt or some form of high interest debt, that's usually about 20% a year. And you're almost never going to make 20% from the stock market unless you invest in Tesla, it seems, at least the past year or so. So these are all the big steps I think that you should at least consider when you get paid. It's just really important to just treat yourself like a business and pay yourself first. I know that money management can kind of seem like a boring topic or something that is maybe a little bit confusing. The fact that people don't know how to manage their money is one of the things that just kind of snowballs, and if you don't know how to manage your money and you make enough money, just because you make enough money and the fact that you don't know how to manage your money, it doesn't matter how much money you make. So hopefully this video was helpful to some of you. Please feel free to like and subscribe. Drop down a comment if you liked this. I would love to continue to make more videos kind of around this topic, and I do plan to. So I hope to see you in the next one. Cheers.